Steve, how are you, my friend?
How are you, Ryan?
I'm doing good, man. And I'm so excited that we're kicking off this mini series for Employee Ownership Month. And I couldn't think of anybody better than you. Honestly, I was looking at October in the podcast calendar, and I've had so much fun getting to know you over the last few years. And it's been even more fun listening to your passion behind employee ownership and the why and what you and EOX are doing. So what I want to do here is give you some time to explain your background, explain EOX, and then we'll be teeing up into the mini series. But why don't you just give everybody a little bit of your background?
Yeah, I appreciate that. And likewise on getting to know you. It's been fun. Love to see how you've even grown your business in the 2 years that we've known each other. And I think this just fits. It fits so perfectly. People are going to see that as they see the guests that we're going to have. Everything you do points, in this direction as well as others. But it's just a perfect fit. So, well, my background is I came out of the Marine Corps and joined a law firm. Happened to be in an employee benefits law firm, and started to work on 401k plans and profit sharing plans. And in 1996, I got introduced to this concept called an ESOP. Started working with a customer on their ESOP, knew absolutely nothing. And I can still see the office that I worked in and the meetings that I used to have with that client. And it's something different. You feel different when you work with a client that's in an employee stock ownership plan. I've come to call it employee ownership because there are a bunch of other options, but for me, that was my introduction in 1996, was working with an ESOP client on the law side. And then eventually started to get on the accounting side. We created a third-party administration firm, which is basically a compliance accounting firm to help, make sure that the plan is being run in accordance with the laws, and the accounting is done and participant statements are done. And the rest is kind of history. In 1996, went to my first ESOP conference in Las Vegas and have been to every single one since.
How many were at that first one, Steve? It had to have been way smaller.
That conference? Way smaller, yeah. But it was still a lot bigger than I thought. I thought this was this little tiny thing, and no, it was already starting to boom. But yeah, I think the last conferences that I've been to, whether it be the ESOP Association or NCEO, we might be at 1,300 participants when we go out there. And we say that's large, and then we laugh. We go, you go out to Vegas and you hop in a cab, and they're talking about 12,000, at their conferences that they want to see. They're like, you're with who? What?
Hey, but it's the start, man.
That's the story of employee ownership. We're just this little tiny brother. They kind of pat you on the head and say, "Oh, that's nice," Well, and
to steal a quote from my partners, man, like they went after they turned it into their company into an ESOP. I mean, they went to a conference and it's just a bunch of ESOP people talking ESOP people, and that's what our goal is to expand that outside of the little niche that everybody goes and talks about it.
Yeah, for sure. I kind of feel the same way when I'm doing my social media, working with my social media people. They continually ask me, are we reaching anybody other than all of us talking to each other? And I said, well, slowly but surely. But so, I did that work for 23 years, had my own small business for a while with my partner, the lawyer. We ended up selling to a small regional bank, and they sold me to another bank. So I was in the bank channel for the last 15 years of my career. And what I did is I traveled around the Midwest with the bankers, and I was the guy that went with the bankers who were the trusted advisors for business owners and sat across the table and talk to them about employee ownership. This is what an ESOP is. This is how it works. And if you're ever interested in it, you know who to call. Still ran that practice of, had clients that were ESOPs and we're helping them, but have been running with employee ownership ever since. Got really involved in the Dakota's chapter of the ESOP Association, which is the organization that supports current ESOPs, helps them with education, kind of a networking. I'm not going to call it a Vistage, but, just really that support group for ESOP-owned companies. So did that for about 15 years, served on their board, was their president, ran their government relations, all on a volunteer basis. So I became quite well known, I think, as, the passion was there. So.
I was gonna say, man, you got I think about how long you've been at this, man. You've been probably watching some pretty interesting things and momentum grow over the last couple decades.
Yeah, I told somebody this the other day. I don't know if it's because of the new job and because I'm more out in the public and seeing things outside of, being in the weeds on what an ESOP is doing. But I feel like there's momentum finally. We've been trying forever to get momentum. Again, it may be because that's what I'm trying to do for a living. But I do feel like there's a movement. We talk about the employee ownership movement, and I'm hoping the time is right. The opportunity is here. And I just think we're finally making a tiny bit of traction.
Why are you so passionate about it, Steve?
Ever since '96 when I started, like I said, it's just something different. It's a different feel when you go into a company. The people that you work with are just incredibly passionate about what they do, and then you start to work with a couple clients, and you kind of get these stories. And I've got thousands of stories of just feel good stories, right? Like when you give people equity in the company in which they work, it can't help but, make them more, better their lives. And so I think I knew about my passion was there, but I think where it really finally hit home was just before I switched over to this new job. I had put an ESOP in place in a manufacturing firm in the Twin Cities, had helped put it in place in 2000. It was an older gentleman. I think he owned 70% of the company. He had 3 managers who he had given equity to, or maybe they bought in. I don't know. I think he bought it when it was a very small company, maybe even working out of a pole shed. But he ran it for a long time. And so here's this business. They have a business owner who doesn't necessarily know what he wants to do, could sell it to his employees. And I don't know how he found out about an ESOP, but he put a partial ESOP in. And that was in 2000. And here you have a manufacturing company that is not, when you go in the back, it's not fun work.
It's not sexy. You don't have a bunch of beanbags and pinball machines and
No. I respect the people that worked in the back on the manufacturing floor. The more I worked with them as participants in the ESOP, the more I respected them. But it's just not work I'm going to want to do, and a lot of us aren't going to want to do. And so, he could have sold this business to anybody, and somehow he stumbled across an ESOP. And over the next 20 years, actually it was 18 years, he went from a partial ESOP where he had his 3 partners. The 3 partners realized, hey, if we sell our shares, we don't have to pay taxes anymore, which we'll get into in one of these episodes. And next thing you know, you fast forward, 18 years. I don't know I don't know the dollar amount of distributions that they made to terminated participants during that time. But I do know in 2018, they sold to a competitor. Not a lot has changed as far as I know in that company, but they sold to a competitor and roughly 175 participants split $26 million.
Whoa.
Think about that. Nothing changed in their job for the worse. In fact, I know it changed for the better. They now had a little voice, but the management didn't change. He stuck around for quite a long time. But for that one decision he made, he changed the lives at that point of 175 participants, not to count all of the temporary employees who came and went in a manufacturing firm who may have gotten, $15,000, $20,000 on the way out the door. But I got to write those checks and hand them out.
That's awesome, man.
I didn't get to hand them out, but I got to go tell the employees what was going to happen. And I was giving checks out, or we were transferring dollar amounts of somewhere between $500,000 and $800,000 for some of those people who had made it up the ranks, and other people who just continued to work in their job. They were, $300,000-$400,000. When you see that and you realize that didn't have to happen, he didn't have to sell to his employees, and you realize how easy that was. Nothing changed. The company was still there. It was a good company when it started. It was a great company when it got done because the employees got to have their voice. The managers felt more important. It's so easy. Like, why can't we have more of these?
And Steve, this is where I like when you and I start rallying about this. It's not like the owners for one that are their payday, because they got paid too, right? So it's like
they got paid too.
Yeah, it's not like they just gifted it and like, oh, they're just saints and they just didn't need the money. Like, no, they got paid fair value for the company. And you got to hand out $26 million to the employees after 20 years.
Yeah. And, I have no idea what he got paid, but let's just say that the growth was significant. Let's say the company, he got $10 million on the front end. I have no idea. So let's say he got $10 million on the front end. He had some earnouts that we're going to talk about, warrants. Maybe he received another $1 million, $2 million. Let's just say he received $12 million up front. Over the next 20 years, they allocated all that equity. They grew the company. And I bet if I looked at distributions, they probably had another 8 million. It's just, it's just a cycle that imagine. And that's what I keep going back to and why I keep doing this. And I get up every morning, just like,
and you're pounding it, man, especially with what you're doing now. I know you're a road warrior and you're out there beating that drum.
Yeah. I just think if we could have, it's not going to be every company, but just think about if every company just think about what America would do. We'll never get there, but man, just give me Give me 3% more of the market share and imagine what we can do for wealth and income inequality. It's just,
and you and I talk about how this is actually bipartisan. It's like ties into conscious capitalism, which is a huge thing that I love. And it's such an interesting vehicle to bridge inequality, to get the owners what they deserve, get the employees to have upside besides just having because saving for retirement on an hourly wage is not very doable these days. So it's just, like you said, I think you and I, like, from the financial lens, I mean, it aligns everybody's incentives. It just targets everybody rolling in the right direction.
And the thing that frustrates me the most, and why I do this as much as I do, is that most everyone that I've ever met has stumbled across employee ownership, and thank God they did. I work with a trucking company now, and the owner started with one truck. He was a trucker. He had a truck. They have over 300 trucks today. They're 13 years into their ESOP, and he was looking to merge with another trucking company, and his attorney happened to hear about an ESOP, and he explored it. Fast forward 13 years, they're sitting on $13 million in the ESOP account balances of about 150, 160 employees, almost all of them truck drivers. Of course, you got the office staff and the dispatchers, but almost all of them drivers. And had that attorney not heard about that, the employees would still have their jobs. Everything would be exactly the same, but they wouldn't be sharing in the wealth. And the other part is, when he turned the keys over to them, you should see how that business changed. I love the guy to death. I consider him a friend. But I'm telling you, when you start a trucking company with one truck, it's your way or the highway.
Well, no pun intended. The keys in the highway, lots of, I love it.
But when he was able to see what they could do and he let go and gave them the reins, the changes that they made were incremental, but they just love what they do. The dispatchers take the phone calls. They take care of their customers. It's, don't get me started.
So let's talk about, we're going to have plenty of these 4 episodes. We're going to dive into it to really give people a visibility into the stuff that I think is a lot of a big black box. But let's talk about EOX and what you're doing now and why you're doing it and how you guys are structured.
So EOX is a national nonprofit organization. It was started inside the National Center for Employee Ownership as an idea of a few people at NCEO. They looked at across the country and they said, there's 8 state centers across the country. 2 of them are the longest standing ones, Ohio and Vermont. And it can't be a coincidence that Ohio and Vermont have the highest per capita ESOP concentration of any other states. That can't be a coincidence. So if we're going to grow employee ownership as the National Center for Employee Ownership, how are we going to do that? Maybe state centers is the way to do that. So they investigated, they put together a task force. They created the Pennsylvania Center for Employee Ownership, and off they went. The Pennsylvania Center for Employee Ownership worked really, really well. They changed their metrics, and all of a sudden they're leading the country or very close to leading the country. And so they kicked it off on July 4th, 2018 in Philadelphia. Not a coincidence. Not a coincidence that we're red, white, and blue. This is the American dream. So why not incorporate in Philly? And they hired me January 1st of 2019, and they gave me one mission. There's 8 state centers now. I don't know what the percentage was, but we want to cover 70% of the U.S. population with a state center.
Nice.
So find those pockets of the country that need a state center. Find those pockets of the country that have support, service providers, technical assistance, and go tell people about ESOPs, worker cooperatives, other forms of employee ownership. But your mission is to open a state center in states where this is going to work. So far, we've opened 12 state centers in our first, we're all coming up on 4 years now. I can't believe that. And add them to the other 8. So we're at 20 state centers. And I think the last time I looked at the penetration rate, I think we're at 64, 63%. So I got a couple more centers to go. My goal was 2025.
To you, man, because you did all that crap in the middle of the pandemic. You just got your job, and then you're like, oh, by the way, I got to open up all these state centers from my basement. So
exactly.
No small feat. That's awesome.
And the state centers, opening a state center, the beginning of that, learning all the nonprofit rules, because they are all independent nonprofits, all propped up by private contributions. We're hoping that, we can get public support through state governments, foundations. But, creating the state centers has been, I don't want to say it's the easy part, because it does take work. But, once you get 1, 2, 3 under your belt, it's kind of like a franchise model. You can get them open if you have the support in the state. You've got boots on the ground. You can do that. Now we're kind of in phase 2, which is, all right, we've got the network. We've got them started. how are we going to pay for this, right? Like how are we going to actually staff them? How are we going to make them or help them with their mission of actually doing that outreach? Because that's their mission. They're in a state. You've got 1 or 2 employees, and they just travel the state virtually or in person and tell anybody and everybody they can what employee ownership is. Yeah, boots on the ground.
Love it. So 2 quick questions before we wrap up and then get into the interview with Dave Diehl. One is, what do you want out of this 4-part mini-series for Employee Ownership Month? Like, what would be your goal for the listeners who are tuning in?
For me, the goal is I would love, and one of the hard things is to get to the business owner. We can get to economic developers, we can get to trusted advisors, chambers of commerce, places that business owners congregate and people that they trust. But we are having a hard time getting to the business owner. And I think a couple reasons. One is most business owners aren't out publicly facing for some reason saying, hey, I'm going to sell my business. Now you're 67 years old. Of course you're selling your business.
It's not, you can't really hide that age.
I don't know why this is a secret to your employees, but apparently you think it's a secret to your employees. So the number one goal for me, other than just pure outreach and education for the entire world to hear this, I would love, since you have such a great audience that I think is focused on entrepreneurs and business owners, I want them to hear the deeper dive. I think it's getting easier for them to Google employee ownership in Minnesota or employee ownership, wherever they are living, they're going to find resources. There's a ton of resources out there. I'm hoping that this can take a deeper dive to give them a little bit better feel of if they want to dive deeper on, how does the transaction actually work? What is a trustee rather than a 2-minute video? I'm hoping that helps give them a little more confidence that this is not a gimmick. It's not a product. And more importantly, don't let the noise get in the way of what's real. I mean, I think that's the second part of this is there's a lot of noise. When people don't understand something, they just kind of push it off and tell you, you go to your trusted advisor and you say, what do you know about this ESOP thing? What do you think? And it's like, it's too expensive. All the noise, and they don't know what they're talking about. I mean, employee ownership is not for everyone. And that's, I think, probably what people are going to see when if they happen to, listen to all of these for this month. I know we're going to be rah, 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 and we're going to go over the board and they're going to get done and say, is there anything wrong with employee ownership? Of course, there's something wrong with every business model, right? I mean, there's pros and cons, but hopefully they can see through that noise as well.
It's a noble mission, my friend. And just as a tee up for the audience too, as we unpack these next few episodes, we're going to be diving deep into these topics that Steve and I have lined out and that I said in the intro. And then when we wrap up these miniseries, Steve, you and I can talk about with a lot of that context, where are the additional resources that people can go into to find on EOX and all the different advisors that are all kind of playing the same game. But between now and then that end of that episode, when we do the recap, where can people find you, find more about EOX?
If you go to our website, eoxnetwork.org, so it's eoxnetwork.org as a nonprofit, lots of resources there, but I think the best resource is to click on the menu item that says state centers. That'll give you the map of all 20 state centers across the country. And if you're in a specific state that has a center, that's where you want to go. Start with the center. It's a safe place for anybody, whether you're an advisor or a business owner or a community leader. It's a safe place. Nobody's there to sell you a product. It's a nonprofit employee just trying to share their wealth of knowledge about employee ownership, and that's where they start. If the state that you live in doesn't have a state center, reach out to me directly, and we'll connect you with those resources. You can always reach out to me directly and connect me with those resources, even if you do have a state, if you just want to, kick the can.
Steve, thank you so much for coming on and participate in these 4-part series with me. And with this, we will be kicking off the Dave Diehl.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks, Ryan.
Steve and Dave, how are we today?
Great, Ryan.
Doing well.
I can already tell we got 3 people on. Like, who's going to talk first?
Yep. All right. If you do that, let's do that again, and we'll do Dave. Dave, you always go first. How's that?
Well, we'll just keep rolling with it. So, Dave, I'm very excited to have you back on the show. Steve and I are excited to be kicking off the ESOP, the Employee Ownership Month, and you and your background with ESOPs, very excited about it. Why don't you give the listeners a little bit of your background and Prairie Capital Advisors' background if they have not caught one of your previous episodes?
Sure. My name is Dave Diehl. I'm the CEO of Prairie Capital Advisors. We have 7 offices located around the country, and we are focused on ownership transition. So whether it be traditional merger and acquisition advisory and selling companies to third parties, management buyouts, but a large specialty that we work in is the ESOP space. So we help establish employee stock ownership plans to help transition ownership from a seller to their employees through a tax advantage trust. And we've been in business. We've been in business for 26 years.
And you guys do, was it like 400 some ESOP valuation updates each year?
Yeah, we have about 310 that we do every year, but we do about 400 valuations broadly over the course of the year.
And Steve, where did you and Dave meet? Because I remember when I was on LinkedIn and all of a sudden, like, of course, Steve, now, like you and I swear to God, every single post about ESOPs and employee ownership, you and I are rallying on them. But where did you guys meet, and what is Prairie's involvement with EOX?
I'm in Washington, D.C. now, but originally from Minnesota, spent 23 years in an ESOP practice in different bank channels in Minnesota, and Prairie Capital, very involved in the Minnesota chapter of the ESOP Association. So from that volunteer standpoint, known about Prairie for a long time. I don't remember when Dave and I met, but it's got to be 10, 15 years ago or more. Probably met some of his colleagues way before that, mainly Victor Aspengren, who was, very, very very plugged in the Minnesota channel.
Yeah, I'm very excited to highlight what you guys have both been doing, because you guys have been at this journey a lot longer than I have, and I just love the fact that we're all trying to spread the word and educate some people. And so we're gonna make this hopefully an easy journey for the listeners as we all three of us are chatting, and I'm kind of guiding us along the way about the transaction and what is the right ESOP, who is a candidate for the ESOPs. But what I wanted to do, Dave, why don't you just we can start from the top of like, what is an ESOP and what is this structure of an ESOP? And then Steve, again, like you and I just kind of tag team this, so we'll just be able to guide through the typical ESOP. And then we're going to be talking about the process of turning it into an ESOP, and then also the deal structure. So Dave, want to just kind of kick us off at the top?
Sure. An ESOP effectively is a tax-advantaged management buyout that's sponsored by, that has certain areas that are sponsored by the government. So basically what an ESOP does is an owner will sell stock into a trust that every employee who meets the requirements is a beneficial owner within that trust. So what effectively happens is a seller can sell their company to this trust. Every year, some shares are allocated to participants. And because of that allocation, the company gets a tax deduction for that. Or in the greatest case, if it's 100% ESOP owned company and it is an S corporation, there are no taxes paid. There are also tax advantages potentially to the seller if they elect something called a 1042 option, which allows them to defer capital gains on the sale. So very interesting structure. It's non-discriminatory. So when the shares are in the plan and they're allocated, they're not allocated based on management's desires. It's based on W-2. But it's a way for the government to help to take shares that are held in one party's hands and distribute them to a much broader group. And those shares are in a tax-advantaged retirement account. And ultimately, that helps to fund retirement. So the government provides these tax savings because of what happens in the transaction, because it deals with two major issues that the government is concerned with. One is retirement dollars and ensuring that people have adequate dollars in retirement. And the second is dealing with kind of the one percenter issue that often shares are owned by very limited amounts of individuals. They end up building a lot of that wealth, and this helps to spread the wealth more broadly.
And what I find very interesting, Steve, because of your background, maybe kind of take it bridge the gap for the listeners, because you were working with 401ks, et cetera, in your past, right? Which I think is so fascinating. Where the ESOP, because it's a pass-through entity, the tax wrapper, maybe kind of expand on what Dave's talking about with that tax wrapper and how that is different than a traditional 401k where you came from.
Yeah, I think the two things that I would highlight that Dave said, which was, first, broad-based ownership. I mean, I think that's the coolest thing. And the reason I've been so passionate about employee ownership is that no matter where you work in a company, an ESOP provides equity in that company for no dollars out of your own pocket. Whether you're the janitor or whether you're the CFO or the HR director or the HR assistant, you're all given equity in the company. And the longer you stay there, the more equity you get. And that equity is identical to a 401k plan in that taxes are not paid until you tap into that equity. So on one hand, ESOPs and 401k plans are the same from the tax wrapper. On the other hand, there's a huge difference. And the big difference is I have to save out of my paycheck every single time I get paid in order to create wealth for myself. Whereas this is sweat equity. I work at a company, kind of like the old pension plans. Look, I'm going to work at a company. They're going to take care of me. The difference between those is I'm getting equity, and the harder I work and the more money this company makes, the more my account is worth. So a little of the same from that tax wrapper, but the biggest difference is I don't have to put money into this. I'm not going to say it's free, but it is almost free. Like the company is making contributions for me. It's not coming from my paycheck. And that's a huge advantage.
I think there's a lot of questions that I hear a lot about. So are the employees ownerships or have an ownership on the cap table of the EIN number of the entity? Or you guys talk about beneficial ownership of the ESOP trust. Do one of you guys want to tackle that?
Sure. I mean, there is no direct ownership via the ESOP other than to the trustee of the trust itself. So the trust holds the stock on behalf of participants. So while they own an economic interest in that stock, they are not individual shareholders. In an ESOP, the ESOP is one singular shareholder. And so that trustee is effectively the party that acts on behalf of those shareholders. And they have a fiduciary responsibility to act in the participants' best interest to protect their retirement savings, which really eliminates one of the grander complications that people see when they're thinking, oh my gosh, every one of my employees is going to be owning stock and trying to make decisions on that stock. That's not the case. I mean, this is a case where a trustee is a professional trustee, or possibly even an internal trustee, is there with a duty to protect the interest of those participants and to act in their best interest.
So let's talk about, before we get into kind of, because I know we want to talk about how employees how they get the shares and how that works on kind of an ongoing basis. But let's talk about, like, what is the target market for ESOPs? Like who's the right candidate for an ESOP, and what's the size, characteristics and attributes of a good ESOP?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think from our perspective, any business that's a strong cash flow business can look to an ESOP as a potential exit. So what you want to see are companies that are producing, solid cash flow, that have an interest, obviously, in transitioning the business. The average size, I would say, is, companies we deal with tend to be about, between, I would say the bulk is between 10 and 50 million in value. So, if you're looking at a company that has a, $2 million EBITDA or more, I mean, they're kind of prime candidates for that. And that really comes down to the kind of the head count too. If you don't have, say, 20 employees, it makes it very difficult to do an ESOP. But we see them across a whole host of industries. For a lot of cases, they're companies that we see a lot of cases where there's family-owned businesses. Maybe they're multi-generation, and they can't stomach the idea of selling to a competitor, or they want to keep the legacy of the business. They want to take care of their employees because their employees have helped them to get there. We've seen some really regional players who are out in rural areas, who want to make sure that the town stays protected. But more often than not, it's just it's a really nice means of transitioning the business, maintaining the legacy, having the company be in a position to operate on an independent basis. The one other thing that I wanted to point out is that it's a lot more controllable transaction than a sale to a third party. I mean, you have a known buyer, which is the ESOP, and you negotiate with that buyer. That doesn't mean the buyer is necessarily going to give you all the terms and maybe the pricing that you need, but you at least have transparency to that. So the process itself is a lot slower. There's not as much risk in the process because you're not opening up your books to competitors and whatnot. So there's a lot of reasons that people go through this, but that in large part, I mean, any company can be. But the one thing I will point out too is that there's a lot of service businesses that are ESOPs. Mm-hmm. So if your assets walk in and out the door every day, it tends to be a very popular strategy within service businesses because those are much more difficult businesses to sell, because it's all about employee retention, client retention, and whatnot. And from a full disclosure standpoint, Prairie Capital is an ESOP ourselves. So we love being an ESOP. We love the idea, the concept. We love that people can come here and know that we're looking to remain independent. They can have a piece of the action if they build in that sweat equity, like Steve was talking about. And again, we have a means of transitioning out the prior ownership.
So I want to get into like the process in a second, but like Steve, I'm curious for like what your exposure with EOX or Dave. Dave, you had mentioned 2 million in EBITDA. When you think about it, like that was kind of always private equity's threshold, because there's a lot of good cash flow with 2 million in EBITDA and above to get creative with deal structures and a lot of ability to reinvest. You think about 80% of the privately held companies are below that, or something along those lines. Are there different ways, or what are you guys seeing as far as advisors or people coming in to help people that are below that? Is there like kind of a bottom threshold of like, hey, because I don't know, Dave, it doesn't economically make sense for your firm, but are there other ways of someone that is below that $2 million and still has 20 employees that it might make sense?
I think that is a gap that we have right now. I'm interested to hear what Dave says, because, you do some of these webinars and seminars and you have professionals, they come back to you and say, hey, you said 20 employees, that's too low. It's supposed to be 30. And you said 2 million in EBITDA. So, the industry still doesn't know the number. And I don't think there is a number. I think what it comes down to is, a lot of the things that Dave said, and to me, it's the value of the business versus the debt that's going to be incurred. Compared to payroll. So what are we, we're giving employees money each year as a profit sharing contribution to pay that loan or pay that debt back. And so if you have a $20 person company that's worth $4 million, that might be a little bit easier to pay down that debt than if you had 20 people and 45 million. So I think there is some connection there between payroll and the value of the company. But to get to your question of what is there for people, companies that are less than that, there is a gap there, unfortunately. And sometimes it comes down to, helping with the management, in my opinion, helping with the management buyout, maybe doing some, stock equity before the purchase, getting the company ready and giving some equity to the management team beforehand to get it to a bigger size. But I'd be interested to hear what Dave says as far as what do we do with those smaller companies. I wish we had a different, like a mini ESOP. I really wish it existed. And so far, there's definitely a worker cooperative. It's a whole nother topic that I love worker cooperatives, but that doesn't fit every business just because they have less than 20 employees. There's a lot of democracy at work that has to happen that doesn't necessarily fit every company.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. It is a gap, and part of the reason it's a gap, and I should preface by saying that the 2 million was kind of like the beginning of the sweet spot. We definitely can see deals that are smaller than that. And the smallest deal I think that we've worked on was about 200,000 in EBITDA, and it was tough to get through. Main reason being they only had 13 employees, which means that there's a lot of caveats that need to be put in the plan document to make sure that it's protected and doesn't violate any ERISA rules. So there are ways to do it, and that client really wanted to do an ESOP, so we were happy to help them to facilitate that. The other piece comes down to fees. And so, there are professionals that need to be a part of this transaction. So when you're looking
David,
at,
I was going to say, before you just start going down the fees, and maybe take it, because I was going to go next to the process. So I think the process is kind of very opaque to some people. So if you talk about the process, I think we can start also cover the fees, because these people need to be paid, right, to get the actual ESOP transaction done. So you want to kind of take if someone wanted to explore an ESOP, what is the actual process that someone would embark upon?
Sure. If someone's looking to explore an ESOP, the general starting point is connecting with a financial advisor and going through the economics of the deal. Obviously, if you're going to enter into a situation where you're selling your business, you want to understand what it's worth. And so you're going to want to have the business valued. But also you're going to want to go through a feasibility analysis. And that feasibility analysis will help you to understand, okay, with the particular value that is associated with the business, how is the ESOP going to pay, and how is the company going to pay off its debt related to the ESOP over the course of time? And thirdly, in that analysis, it will show how are the shares being allocated. Effectively, in a feasibility, you're creating a bit of a blueprint for the transaction, and you're providing a lot of transparency with regards to the mechanics of how an ESOP works. And so that's step one. And as we were talking about the fees, having one party provide this sort of detail gets you to a point where you don't have to incur any other fees. So this is really just the investigation side of things, in understanding value, structure, how an ESOP works, what it means to be an ESOP, understanding all the different aspects of what it potentially could be and what could potentially be involved in a transaction. So, that's step one. If you
without you're not transacting, right? You're just building the blueprint, like you said. It's almost, would you correlate that, Dave, to like if someone were to hire you guys to take someone to a third party to sell to a third party private equity firm, the data room, due diligence. I mean, you're still incurring work ahead of some sort of transaction, right?
Absolutely. I mean, to get more micro there, we'd send out an information request list. We'd gather a whole bunch of financial data on the company's, customers, their suppliers, their personnel, wanting to get a full understanding of the business in order to create, that valuation. That same information we'd be using later if we moved forward with the transaction. But, the goal is to pull all of that together. So and you do that certainly on the front end of an M&A deal. But in M&A deals, generally speaking, people are just looking at value and they're saying, what could it be worth? What do you think? Who do you think the potential buyers would be for my business? And what's the value? In an ESOP, we're getting far more granular on what it means because the company really needs to understand, what debt is available to go and finance this. How is this going to be structured? And then also, what are the operations going to look like afterwards? And, how do those cash flows work? And am I comfortable with, the end capital structure and, cash flow dynamics that are associated with the transaction?
So then when you say financial advisor too, because I think for the listeners it's not like the typical wealth manager. You're talking like in Prairie Capital Advisors is a financial advisor. You're talking about the sell side investment banker. Is that what you're referring to, right, Dave?
That's correct. So, I mean, you'd be wanting to have someone who understands ESOPs and is obviously very educated in valuation that can provide that for you.
So then, kind of going to the next stage too, maybe Steve, this is where you can interject. Cause I think, EOX with what you're doing with your network of advisors of like, there's a lot of people that are involved in this transaction. Cause I think if we can take it from, okay, so let's say someone's gone through that feasibility and they're like, okay, here's the rough structure. And we'll get into the structure too in a sec, but like the other players, who else is necessary to get through that full completion? What is what's the cast of characters and what's their roles?
Go ahead, Dave. You're in those transactions. I can ask you. I've got a couple questions for you too. But if you want to add on the other side, the trustee side, I think is these transactions are not a lot different from what I know than a merger acquisition. It's just that there's a lot more details, like you said, to make sure that this company is going to survive afterwards. There's a lot more attention put on the front end. But I think there's still just at the end, there's the sell side and the buy side and the advisors that go with it.
Yeah.
Right?
So, I mean, you're looking at, once you go down the path of conducting this feasibility analysis, if someone wanted to move forward, you're going to establish your teams. And, as Steve said, you're looking at building teams on both sides. There is a buyer, there is a seller. While the ESOP trust is a newly formed entity and you'd be hiring in a new trustee, they are the singular buyer that you'd be looking to work with. However, each side is going to need some duplication, similar to an M&A transaction. So you're looking at the financial advisor or the sell side advisor on the company's behalf, working alongside a corporate attorney and possibly even an ERISA attorney, but oftentimes those can be the same party. And then on the other side is going to be a trustee who's going to be ultimately negotiating the transaction, and they're going to hire their own independent financial advisor so that they have confidence in the pricing of the deal, and their own legal advisor who's going to negotiate the end deal terms there. So you end up with two different sides, negotiating against one another, each having financial representation and each having legal representation. And then there's also some administrative elements that are corporate items. So you need to have an administrator over the plan to allocate the stock and to do a lot of testing. Those parties would also come into play a little bit later.
And when you said earlier that this is a friendly negotiation, you get to pick your trustee, right? Like, so this is not some trustee that parachutes in from Wall Street that is just going to grind you to a pulp, right? I mean, like, you actually get to interview and hire your own trustee, right?
Absolutely. So, I mean, and a lot of that's just about finding the right. I mean, right. You're obviously going to want to find someone who's qualified, but a lot of it's about finding the right
quality one, right? Yeah. I just find it so fascinating that people like not understanding that this trustee is the buyer and it's a financial buy and purchase. I mean, David, I think about the interview that you and I did, probably a couple months ago, talking about the intrinsic financial value based on the cash flow. I mean, that's when you're talking about everybody's focused in on what is that cash flow going to yield for value. And like everybody's just focused in on that, aren't they?
Absolutely. I mean, there is no synergy here. And the business is still going to be the business once the ownership transitions. It's simply going from one owner of that business to the hands of another owner that now has potentially a lot of tax advantages to the company and having that new owner. But otherwise, I mean, nothing's changing. It's still a company that's operating and generating the cash flow that it likely was before. And when you're looking at cash flow, I mean, that's really that's what's going to be paying down the debt, but that's really what you're valuing here. You're looking at the riskiness of that cash flow stream and coming up with a value. With third-party sales, a lot of times you're looking at situations where an acquirer may be eliminating staff, they may be consolidating facilities. There may be a lot of things that enhance that cash flow that allow them to pay a higher multiple. But with an ESOP, there isn't any of these synergies, so therefore you're really dependent on the company's ability to generate cash flow. Which
we can get into the deal structure and how that works in a second. Steve, did you have any questions about the other advisors and stuff like that Dave was referring to?
No, I think it's important to note what Dave said, which is the cash flow is the main part of the deal. You have a trustee that's coming in who's highly regulated by the Department of Labor and seems to get even more highly regulated all the time for good reason and bad. We could go deep into that. But ultimately, what they're trying to do is say, I'm going to purchase this business on behalf of the employees for a price that I'm comfortable that we can continue to operate this business and make it grow and not make it go under. I mean, that's ultimately what they're trying to do. Again, synergies and all of that goes away from an M&A deal. But that trustee is there as a friendly buyer, but they're there to make sure that they're not overpaying, that the deal structure isn't too restrictive, that this is going to continue on because the business owner wants to leave their legacy. They want to get paid a fair price, but they want to leave their legacy and they want to see it move on and continue on just as much as the employees do as they take the reins.
It's so crazy, guys. Like, I think you guys both are alluding to this. I mean, I've been beating this drum now for years of you have your leadership management role versus your ownership, which is your asset. I mean, like, you have to separate those two because, I mean, the more and more people hear about ESOPs, I'm like, wait a second, I can monetize my company and not have to gut it or sell it to a third party. Like, it's not, or the only option people thought was a seller's note to some internal buyer, or leverage it up with a bank for an internal buyer, but you're still paying your taxes. So it's just, I think you're both highlighting that main topic that so many people conflate. I mean, do you guys struggle? Do you guys see you guys having to have conversations by explaining to there's literally nothing that's going to change with the company after you do the ESOP?
All the time. And that's one of the biggest concerns that people have is that this unknown trustee is going to swoop in and they're going to start dictating how to run the company. I think what's important to note is that in any fiduciary capacity, the risk that you have is the risk to making change, to making an active decision. So the active decision the trustee is making when they purchase the stock is really, it's relatively limited. And then they actually can't under ERISA pay more than fair market value. So that's why they're getting their financial advisor to do their analysis, and their financial advisor will give them a fairness opinion to the fact that they didn't pay more than fair market value. So when they make that decision, they're already vested in the management team and what the business is, what the business has been created. So for them to come in and try and change anything would be extremely problematic. So, as far as everything goes, this is really a passive owner. Now, will they take action if absolutely needed? Yes. I mean, there are scenarios that can play out where if the company starts to to falter, they'll become a little bit more involved. If there's fraud or if there's something else like that, they'll definitely get extremely involved. But short of that, what they want to do on an annual basis is make sure that the investment that they made is functioning the way that they had intended, and that they're receiving a fair return based on the investment they've made. And that doesn't mean that the business can't have a lower growth profile than they were anticipating, or that they needed to have perfect projections. I mean, it is a business, so there is risk associated with this, and there's risk priced in to the valuation. So people shouldn't be scared that maybe they all of a sudden a recession hits right after they do a deal and they're somehow at risk. That's not the case. That's why the trustee is going through their procedural prudence when they enter into the transaction, to know that they have and can show that this was the right investment and it was the right price.
And it's the same risk before and after the deal. It's just the same company.
Yeah, absolutely.
Steve, you had something?
Ryan, Dave talks a lot about, or we talk that there's a lot of parties involved. There's this trustee who have fiduciary responsibility. I mean, there's a lot going on in this ESOP deal. I wonder, because you're involved in the M&A side as well, Dave, how much different is an ESOP transaction compared to an M&A when it comes to complexity? Because I hear all the time pushback on ESOPs to say, I'm not going to say who it is, it's an advisor, but it's a trusted advisor to a business owner who tells them, oh, don't go down that path. That is so complex and expensive. It's just not worth your time. Is it that much more complex than an M&A transaction?
I guess two things. I would say that neither of those is factually accurate. Definitely, and I hear it all the time too, Steve, and that's the problem. But the problem for the M&A advisor is that an ESOP is a competitor.
Yeah, 100%. It's so
Prairie
true.
Capital, an ESOP is just another means of exiting next to M&A. So we're agnostic to which direction they go or what product they choose, whatnot. But the reality is that an ESOP is less expensive. Yes, there are a good amount of advisors, but the fees associated with ESOPs tend to be certainly less than an M&A transaction. Secondly, the other piece in saying how complex they are, there is some complexity as it relates to the Department of Labor and the rules they have. When you hire good advisors, they're the ones that are dealing with those rules. So they're just telling you, what you can do and what you can't do based on those rules. It's not something that should really impact the seller or the company afterwards. So at the end of the day, again, I boil it down to as simple as it can be. It's a tax-advantaged management buyout, or leverage buyout. So there's no difference here than anyone else who's looking at putting together a leverage deal, including private equity. It's simply that no one has to put up any of their own money individually, and the government's giving tax breaks so that it's not private equity or one individual owning the company. It's all of the employees collectively.
Which, by the way, I can't believe we got a half hour in where we didn't talk about the fact you don't pay taxes after you're done, right? So we made it in 30 minutes in. Why don't you explain what in the layman's terms, tax advantage, what that means?
Okay, so the tax advantage is this, and I'm going to go with a partial ESOP or a C Corp ESOP first. Let's just say you do a $5 million transaction. As that stock is allocated, you're going to receive $5 million of tax breaks. So no different than you making a contribution to a profit sharing plan. You're going to pay this $5 million over the course of a number of years to release the stock, and you'll receive, say you made a $500,000 contribution year one, you're going to receive a $500,000 tax deduction. Now you'd say, well, I just sent $500,000 out to pay that debt. The difference is that the trust borrowed the money from the company. So when you make that $500,000 contribution to the trust needs to pay back the $500,000 that it owes to the company. So it's cash neutral to the company, but it creates a deduction. Now, the crown jewel of ESOPs is to be 100% ESOP-owned company that is an S corporation. And because an S corporation is a conduit tax entity, it sends its tax obligation to its shareholders. In this instance, the shareholder is a tax-exempt trust. So therefore, there are no taxes owed by the trust, and the company doesn't even need to make distributions because there is no tax owed. And so all the cash flow that's generated by the company, all the pre-tax, what's normally considered pre-tax cash flow that's generated by the company is available. And it's available for debt service. So in the early going, when you do a transaction and there is a lot of debt, the government is effectively picking up about 40% of your leverage buyout payment. So you can enhance payments to the bank. You can accelerate the payment of debt to reduce that far more rapidly than you can in a standard management buyout.
Well, and like I think about like how many times, I live in Minnesota, so you make $1 million in pre-tax cash flow, 400 grand is going to the government. And I can't imagine a lot of banks, like if you've been proven like, hey, by the way, I can consistently make $1 million in cash flow, and now I don't have to pay 400 grand in taxes. I'm assuming a lot of banks will line up to give you a loan because you've proven that you can afford to pay the taxes for however long that you have been.
Absolutely. The banks are still banks, and they still look at their normal metrics and whatnot. So I don't want to say that this takes them into a whole different realm.
Nice, right? Dave's being nice.
But the fact is that they've got their own standards and their own controls. There are a good amount of banks that are ESOP friendly. They understand that this does mean that there's enhancement to cash flows, which means that there's a risk reduction in the same amount of credit that they'd give the ESOP relative to management or any third party. So we will see more flexible structures, often more absolute dollars available in an ESOP deal in most situations. That said, there are some accounting complexities that don't fit in that bank box. So if you work with a bank that doesn't understand ESOPs, oftentimes an ESOP will actually result in you getting less capital. So it's important to either have your advisor make sure that they fully explain and it's understood with your bank, what this means, or work with a known ESOP lender who has a group dedicated to these sorts of transactions.
So before we get into how, when you say less capital, which is when and how the seller gets their money, before we get into that, I want to go back to the complexity for a second, because I liked how you asked that question, Stephen. Like, what's so crazy, guys? Yes, when I think about complex, the Department of Labor, you got this trustee, ERISA, sure, but you already have a 401k. Essentially, you have to have your financials clean so you can it's not like it's just running it like a normal business. So you have like the right structure and the right financials and the right plan. And then you can do whatever the heck you want as far as monetizing that asset. And is the one difference, Dave and Steve, is that all of those both sides are paid for by the same asset, right? Versus, in a third party, someone would be picking up the bill on half of the advisors. But like you said, Dave, people are still working collaboratively. So I'm thinking about the complexity. It's really just not that much more complex, other than the fact that you're going to have the nuances of the DOL, ERISA, and the trustee and stuff.
Here's a complexity that, and I'm not in the M&A world, but Dave, you can tell me if I'm right or not. But the complexity that they don't talk about is nobody's coming through your business and digging. And you sell your house, and people walk through. They don't open the closets typically. They don't open the drawers. They come in to buy your business, and it's usually your competitors. They're digging in everything. From what I know, they're digging deep. No one's digging in this area. You have nobody else looking at your business. It's just a fair deal on both sides, fair market value. And you're not having to have the deal have 8 people competing for your business. You get to the end, and then all of a sudden you're down to 2. And in the end, maybe 2 of them go away because something goes wrong. It's a friendly negotiation. And I think people forget about that complexity. And then the second piece is, unfortunately in the ESOP world, we write checks to our advisors rather than having it be, taken from our gross proceeds so we get a net check. Just like when we sell our house, I don't know what the world would be like if we had to write a check to real estate agents. I love real estate agents. I have a best friend who's a real estate agent. But can you imagine if we had to write checks out of our checking account to the people that represented us? It might be a little different world. So those are 2 things that I tell business owners: is don't get bamboozled by advisors that tell you the opposite if they don't exactly share what the other side.
Yeah, and Steve, I think that's a great point, and I forgot to bring that up before because I was thinking about it while you were speaking on a question previously. But you're right. One of the biggest differences from an M&A standpoint is just the sheer level of due diligence. The ESOP basically is taking information at face. Are they going to conduct diligence? Absolutely. But are they going to send in a team of 5 people for a month to go through your financial statements, to go through extensive interviews? They are not. So they're going to have a high level of confidence, but they're not going to be scrutinizing things at the same level as any sort of M&A transaction, whether it be strategic or PE. The other thing that you don't tend to see either because of this is you don't tend to see an ESOP walking back on its price. So the due diligence process in M&A is to make sure that everything is the way it is. And quite honestly, the way it is for any buyer in the M&A world or private equity world is that things are perfect relative to the situation that they're analyzing. So any imperfection starts to knock down price and starts to build some additional tension. It creates more difficulty in that negotiation, and so there's a lot of what goes on in an M&A deal like that just isn't part of an ESOP. There is this friendly, situation, that exists. So it's a much different scenario. And there are some.
Well, I was gonna say, so it's not only retrading the enterprise or equity value of the deal, the enterprise value of the deal, but like the deal structure, right? How many buyers do you get into where you think that you think what the deal structure, all cash or this much, and then the enterprise value retrades and the deal structure retrades. And correct me if I'm wrong, but if you do an ESOP feasibility, so let's say for all intents and purposes, you engaging with an investment banker for, call it 20 to 40 grand. And then an ESOP feasibility, roughly, percentage margin, close to about the same engagement. I don't know. I might be slightly wrong, but with an ESOP feasibility, you're going to go in having an idea of the value that you're going to get, the deal structure. You're going in there and you're not going to then engage with all these advisors and have the whole thing blow up, right? You're probably going to the next stage doing the deal versus in a third party. Like Steve said, you could go through all that, spend $500,000 and a year of your life and have nothing at the end.
That's correct. I mean, you can conceptually have the same thing happen in an ESOP, but it would mean that your advisor, probably your sell-side advisor, wasn't being realistic with regards to their value. So again, it's important to get credible people to be working with you, because it's very rare that if we lay out a structure that we think is doable, I mean, we're going to give a little bit of a range when we're laying things out as far as where things can be in the end, but we're going to be within that range no matter what. So if they decide to go forward, so long as the business continues to perform, they'll tend to have that. Where you're right. I mean, in other deals, there are a whole lot more variables, and you'll see a heck of a lot more M&A deals where a lot of fees are paid and no deal is completed. The other thing I wanted to mention too, because you mentioned this before, Ryan, is on the fees and saying that the fees may be big, or if it's because one person or just a company is cutting the check rather than it being split between two parties. For a lot of companies, particularly ones of scale, if they start looking at fees, I had this discussion, once with a gentleman, and it was basically he said, "Wow, there's a lot of fees here." And my point was, okay, we started talking 3 months ago, and if we did the ESOP deal 3 months ago, how much would you have paid in taxes? And it was less than the deal fees that we had in the transaction. And all of a sudden, he just stopped, and he's like, "Oh my God, we're paying these same deal fees quarterly because the structure isn't in place." Right. So I think you have to get it in the right context.
Oh, totally, Dave. And the amount of people that go through our training, well, I heard ESOPs are really expensive to manage after you do them. What the hell? You're saving $400,000 on $1 million, and you're complaining about the $35,000 valuation update. I just don't it. Just never processed for me, and I've never really heard anybody give a good answer to how I bring it back up. I don't know what the deal is.
No, it's just it's looking for the unicorn, right? But it's not all upside. There's a few downsides, but it's so fractional that it's impossible to justify. The ROI is way too high to focus on the fees to that degree.
And then I want to tee up so talking about the deal structure and how the money and the funds flow. So when I think about because starting with the valuation, if someone had two situations, Dave, if they wanted to sell to a third party right now versus do an ESOP, the enterprise value of the third party might be higher, but based on how you structure the ESOP over the course of your 5 to 6, 7 years, whatever, your net proceeds might be more. or comparable with an ESOP based on the deal structure. So you want to kind of tee it up like, what are the typical ways that the seller would get their money?
Okay. Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest differences here too, is that, in an M&A deal, you're likely to be receiving virtually all your proceeds at close. I mean, there's going to be an escrow, there may be an earnout, but if you cut a deal, you're getting a significant check day one for virtually all the value of the business. With an ESOP, the company is the only sponsor here, so the company needs to come up with the money. And generally speaking, what tends to happen is that I'll just use something of a 6 times multiple. Like, let's say you have a business that's at a 6 times multiple. You'll go to 6 times EBITDA in that instance. You'll go to the bank and you'll be able to borrow, say, three times EBITDA. The bank can lend you that money. So day one, you're getting 50% of your proceeds out of the ESOP deal. Now, it's very costly to extend beyond what the senior lender is willing to lend. So in most circumstances, someone will take seller notes for the balance. So you're looking at a case where you get 3 turns of EBITDA. Let's say it's a $10 million deal.
Pick a number, right?
Yeah, you're getting $5 million day one, and $5 million is owed to you over the course of time. And I would tell you that in any context outside of an ESOP, if someone tells you to hold seller notes, you should run. However, in an ESOP situation, and most sellers have some involvement with the company, whether it be board or continuing to operate after they sell the business. So they're going to be tied on anyway. So they have an ability to oversee the business as it's operating and its ability to pay down its debt. Now, the company isn't paying taxes anymore if this was a 100% deal. So it's paying off its debt to the bank, say in 3 years, or actually I should say in 5 years. So in year 5, you're likely to go to the bank and be able to finance out the balance. And it can be more rapid, but I think that's a safe number to say. But so you'd be able to go and refinance out and get all the money out in 5 years. But the nice thing is this, most people when they sell their businesses are looking, if you sold to in an M&A transaction, you get your money. What do? You go to your wealth advisor. The wealth advisor puts you in a 60-40 portfolio potentially. You get 60% equity, 40% debt. In this case, you've got half your money, so you could put that in stocks, and the other half is effectively a bond portfolio. The difference here is that, one, you don't owe tax on that money that you roll into a note until you receive it. So the principal balance of that note that you're being paid interest on is actually on a pre-tax basis. Secondly, you're subordinate to the bank. So you're receiving a much higher rate of return than you would otherwise. So let's just say you get a 10% return on that note. You're getting 10% money on a pre-tax balance rather than, 3% money on, something that's 70%.
Is it still 10% with the federal funds rate these days? 10% sounded way cooler last year when you and I did this than it did right now.
Well, agreed. Well, and it's going up, but I don't want to inflate people's expectations.
I know. We never know when this is going to live along.
So but you are looking at double-digit returns. So I mean, it's not that different than when you had the equity in your hands in the first place, but you have a defined exit, which is the beautiful part. And with that, often there's part of that 10% return can be warrants. So you can have, which is basically acts like a stock option. So rather than paying a full cash coupon of 10%, it might be 5% as a cash coupon, and the rest is in warrants that are tied to the stock price. So you can still maintain kind of an equity-like function there, and there's some real good tax advantages to the warrant too, in that it's worth very little when it's issued, and you have the ability to transfer that to other generations if you're looking to do some estate planning. Move money that's worth very little today that will have a very high likelihood of large value later. So to your point, I mean, the return dynamics can really put you in a place that's as good.
Can you unpack the warrants a little bit more? Because I that was good starting point of it's a stock option, but if someone is very bullish about the future strategy of their company, and they got a good team and they built a good business. And why warrants? What does it do? Unpack that a little bit more. And then I want to tie that into the estate planning. Cause again, I think that's very fascinating.
Sure. So the warrants, again, produce a return component for the note. So if it's a 10% return, and again, it can certainly be higher than that, but I don't like to blow things up. You have a situation where half your return on this note is going to be in the form of a warrant. Again, a warrant is like a stock option. So basically there's after the transaction, there'll be the price of a stock. Let's say that's $1. The warrant will basically allow you the ability to purchase a share for $1. So day one, you have an option that has an ability to buy a share at $1. The price is at $1, so therefore there's no real value. You could just buy the share. But as the business grows in value, the value of that warrant grows. And in most circumstances, you'd say, well, you're just thinking about, I'm thinking of my normal stock in the stock market and its price is escalating at 10% per year. That's the type of return you're thinking. But that's not the case with an ESOP. With an ESOP, because it's effectively 100% leveraged in this scenario, it's like a house. So you have a $1 million house. Think if you had $1 million mortgage on that house. Now think if you pay off $100,000 of that mortgage, and then, so now you've got, $100,000 of equity. Now the next year you pay off $100,000 of mortgage, and then the value of that house grows by 10%. Mm-hmm. So that's $1 million value house. You've paid off your mortgage. Now you've just gone from $100,000 of equity to $300,000 of equity. I mean, that's the type of growth trajectory that most of these ESOPs have in the short term, particularly because they're not paying taxes. So they're paying off that much more debt. So that's why I was saying that there's a very high probability that the warrants are worth a significant amount of value on the back end of this. And it really helps the trustee as well, because the trustee is saying, well, why would I accept warrants? Why would I give up some of my upside in the business? And the reason that they do that is because if the company doesn't perform as anticipated, or performs well worse than anticipated, their cost of that 10% note goes down significantly, because now they need to buy out the warrant at a much lower price than was anticipated. So it lowers their cost to get into the transaction. So it's a good hedge for the trustee. But to your point, it provides a lot of upside to someone who's bullish on their company after they sold it and are thinking, I'd really like some equity tie. This warrant gives them the ability to be tied to that.
And I think the thing to think about, Ryan, that I always tell people is, if I'm a business owner and I've gotten to 66 years old and I just want my money and I want to ride off it in the sunset, whether I want to leave a legacy and take care of my employees or not, if that may not be as highly important to me as just being done. And those kind of business owners, ESOPs are wonderful, and there's so many advantages that we talked about, but there's owners out there that say, I don't care about all that. Just give me my money and let me move on. And they're probably not ESOP candidates, even if their business is a candidate. But for those business owners who are not ready to run right off into the sunset, who see this back end that Dave talks about, see the ability to stay involved in a part-time basis, or even sometimes in a partial ESOP sale, stay involved as CEO because they're going to do this when they're 45 instead of 65. For those business owners, it's just, there's so many great things in an ESOP, but there are people who just say, nope, I want 100% of my check, not 50% or 30%.
I think I don't know what you think, Dave, but I think it's a false notion anyways. I agree with you, Steve, 100%. But unless you're going to, from what I see a lot, unless you sell to a third party like we did, that's a competitor where there's synergies and half the people go away and all the roles are taken over by the new person, which is small percentage, I think, you're going to roll equity, you're going to have an earnout, and you're going to be I hear the same, BS reasons all day long. I'm like, so for every story I hear about complaints about this, I hear 7 other stories about the person that's sitting at a private equity firm that has no say, that's got rolled equity, that has a capital call, that has no decision-making ability, and that wants to quit. So I hear what you're saying, and I agree with you. And I don't know if it has more to do with with an ESOP, you have to build a good company, period.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
Dave, there was this quote on the last interview, man. Like, it was towards the end, you're like, it's just all about the cash flow. You just kind of like, after an hour, you just kind of went back to like, yeah, if you build something with cash flow, you have options, right?
Absolutely. And you're right. I mean, and in the, it's not as clean a cut in the M&A world as it would seem relative to this in most instances. If you really want a clean cut, it's going to hurt your pricing power. I mean, you're going to limit your buyer pool because there are a lot that are going to, certainly in private equity, there's a lot that are going to want you to roll equity. And there's a lot that are going to stay involved. In most instances, they're looking for a 2-year employment agreement anyway. So you're going to have some tie. But it just, but there's different desires and there's different, goals of sellers, and sometimes they fit with an ESOP and sometimes they don't. So
totally agree. And I think what we're all trying to do here is just kind of make sure that every option has got the level playing field that all the other ones do. And
exactly. And
Steve, one of the things that you and I are so damn passionate about is, conscious capitalism, this is one of the most bipartisan, I think, is it the only thing that's bipartisan these days? But let's talk a little bit, and I know we're getting a little bit short here on time, but let's talk about how the employees actually get their shares. Like, what is the structure of how employees get vested in, or what are the options? I don't know which one of you guys wants to take that, or Steve, maybe tee up a couple questions to Dave.
I used to do that for a living, so I can do it real quick if you want. I mean, what it comes down to, we've said before, is that at the end of the day, on an annual basis, the company makes a profit sharing contribution. I mean, at its purest form, an ESOP, the trust in an ESOP is a profit sharing plan. And so we're making a contribution to pay down that debt. And if we make a contribution of $100,000, we split that $100,000 to employees based on W-2 wages. Maybe we can, put in years of service as well. Those are kind of the two main things you can use. But we're allocating across the board to every eligible employee on some sort of formula. And we turn around and exchange that cash that we gave them for the shares that are released that year based on the loan. I mean, I get cash as an employee, as a profit sharing contribution. I give it to the company and they give me shares. Those shares sit in my account. There's a legal document that tells me how long I have to be around to earn those shares 100% before I leave. It can be, 3 years, 5 years. I better make sure I've been a couple of years since I did this. But it's a graduated schedule or a cliff schedule, but you have to be around for a while to, actually earn them, but they will be in your account. And then we'll talk about that in other episodes on how you get paid out. But at the end of the day, it's a profit sharing contribution that is exchanged for shares based on my.
And Ryan, the one thing that I think is important in that too, and Steve outlined, but the interesting thing is that the seller or the sponsoring company gets to determine how those shares are paid, like the longevity. So they can target a benefit level to their employees. They may say, I want a 10% benefit level. Or they can say, okay, we're going to put in a 20-year loan, which means that in that case, 5% of the stock that originally purchased is being allocated every year. But you have a say in that. I just want to make sure that people understood there's no government mandate as far as how these are allocated. You want to make sure that the plan fits your strategic objectives of the company.
Well, and what I think is so, again, I'm just, the reason I get so passionate about this is because I'm a control freak, and I think a lot of entrepreneurs are too. And there's so much control that they have in designing this, right? If they built a good company. So like everything you guys were just talking about, that's part of the feasibility, right? So you're going into the transaction with a blueprint of all these things that we've discussed. It's you're going in eyes wide open for the most part, right? I mean, from the feasibility, Dave, to actually transacting, is there anything monumentally that would change?
Not really. I mean, it's really about refining rather than fundamentally changing. So generally speaking, we'll have that core blueprint. I mean, and we may have 3 or 4 iterations of it when working with a client to make sure that as they learn more about the process, what it is ultimately that they're looking for. But as we get closer, that's when it starts sinking in more. It starts becoming a little bit more real. And it's it's minor refinements more than anything else. There's generally not any major issue that comes up that causes a deviation from that plan.
And that refinement is really on the other side with the trustee, because the trustee has to be an independent buyer. They can't say, well, this is what this is what the selling shareholder wants. Here's the deal they presented to us. And they're going to present that deal. But the trustee comes in and makes those little refinements and says, and typically not in the stock allocation or things like that, but maybe they look at it and say, is this a high enough benefit for the employees? Do you have a 70-year loan? I don't know if those exist, but those are the kinds of refinements that the trustees come in and just say, look, we're trying to make the best benefit for the employees, keep the company running, but we have to be independent. We can't just take what you presented to us. But it is such I hate to use the word friendly negotiation, but there's no other way to say it. It's negotiation, but Dave works with trustees, the same trustees all the time, and they both want something on each side, but it's still that at the end of the day, they're still working together on the next transaction.
I love it, guys. This is a great intro to this mini series, and especially for Employee Ownership Month. I want to ask you guys just last two questions, and then Dave, obviously, I want to get your contact information for the listeners. But with Employee Ownership Month, I want to. What brings you joy out of each of you guys, out of talking about this and helping with ESOPs? I want to start with you, Steve.
At the end of the day, I said it at the beginning, it's broad-based employee ownership. I'm providing and by helping to promote employee ownership. And again, you said it best. We just want it to be at the table. What's it in the Hamilton musical? Want to be in the room, right? I probably got that wrong, but just want to be in the room where it happens. That's what it is. I want to be in the room where it happens. I want employee ownership to be on the table for every single selling shareholder. And it's not. It's, if we're lucky, it's 2 or 3, that are in the room. And so by giving employees that equity, sweat equity, giving them a piece of the pie, we are creating wealth for no matter who you are at the company. It doesn't matter your education level, the color of your skin. Nothing matters other than you are working hard to contribute to this company, and we're going to share in the profits. And that just gives me chills even saying it, because who wouldn't want to work for a company where I get to share in the profits because I work harder? And that's what keeps me going every single day.
How about you, Dave?
I share a lot of similar sentiments on that front, but it's just, again, the whole thing is about education and about recognition that this is an alternative. And the reason that there aren't more is because, again, they compete with core M&A, and there's just not as much, there hasn't been as much publicity on it over the course of time. It's getting there, and we're working on getting it there. But it's important for people to understand all their options. And I can't tell you how many people we get introduced to that are like, I had no idea that this was available. Entrepreneurs are hardwired. They're going in to run their business. They're there to create a business. They're not there to understand what their options are. They're not even thinking about exiting oftentimes until it's there. Sometimes you'll have some great people that are thinking, okay, 10 years in advance, I'm planning and whatnot, but most are they're being reactive to the fact that they're ready to go, or maybe some health event has happened that they're looking to sell or something like that. I think getting people educated as this being an option and understanding it is key. And there's just a bit of a different feeling. Just the biggest example I can give you is if we do an M&A transaction and I'm in the room when the M&A transaction gets announced to the employees, there's panic. When we do an ESOP transaction and it gets announced to their employees, once they understand it, or maybe in the case that they've known another one in the industry that has one, there's elation. Yeah. And there's, it's just a very different structure from that standpoint. So I certainly get a lot of satisfaction from that. I get a lot of satisfaction from us being an ESOP. I love going out and seeing somebody that's been here for 2 years and, they're getting their statement and it's all of a sudden starting to get to be something meaningful. It's just a good feeling, and it puts you all in the same boat rowing together. So it's, ESOPs have also been proven to be, more productive from a business perspective. There's a lot of good things to come out of it.
I love it. And I'll add to it that I think what's so fascinating is if you focus on growing a valuable business by creating sustainable, predictable, and transferable cash flow, you can just grow and pre-engineer the equity transaction you want without having to time a third party or figure out some synergies. There's so much control within the entrepreneur's grasp if they truly do this way ahead of time. And so I hope for everything that we're all doing together that we can shine the light on, hey, it's something that's out there, but if they focus on it now, it doesn't have to be something that we're all pedaling backwards trying to figure out how to recoup for some lost time. Dave, thank you so much for coming on the show. What is the best way for our listeners to get in touch with you?
You can check out our website at prairiecap.com, prairiecap.com. And you can reach me at Diehl at prairiecap.com. That's Diehl at prairiecap.com.
And I'm going to say prairiecap.com again, because we all know that Wendy, who runs your marketing, will let me know if I get that wrong again. So thank you, Wendy. So Steve, because we're going to be doing this mini series together, we got a couple more episodes, but why don't you give everybody EOX's contact information, where to check you out if they're going to be following along the journey?
It's eoxnetwork.org. We're a national nonprofit, so that's the .org. So eoxnetwork.org. And my email address is sstorkan, which is SSTORKAN at eoxnetwork.org.
Thanks, guys. This has been a lot of fun.
All right. Thanks, Ryan.